Good morning. Hello, welcome back. Glad to see you. I just recorded this video, truth be told. Full disclosure, I recorded it, and I thought to myself, oh, maybe we can do better. That was probably a lie. Am I lying to myself? Yes. Am I doing it anyway? You betcha. After yesterday's video, and for those of you who are coming across this, and it's no longer, pertinent to say or correct to say yesterday, that was about the Microsoft's closure of some Bethesda studios, including Tango Gameworks and one of the Arcane branches. I just got to thinking about a couple of things that were just rolling through the old Chrome Dome. Shocking, I know. Thoughts do occasionally happen up here. It's not frequent, and there is smoke, but it happens. And I just thought I'd put together a little video this morning as I'm drinking my cheap, terrible tasting Timmy's, and before I head out to get some errands done this morning, I just thought I'd put a little thing together, and because I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts about this as well. But I had two kind of like main thoughts. One doesn't necessarily lead anywhere in particular. I just think that there's some interesting parallels to be made, and then the other is more of a thought experiment where I kind of went down a bit of a rabbit hole of sorts to see if there was any kind of support for it, and from a data perspective and just to talk about it. So the first thing is that I think there's some interesting comparisons to be made between the early-ish or burgeoning movie industry and modern games as an industry. And then the second thing is that I believe that at a more macro level, or a more macro level from a company perspective, so your Sonys, your Microsofts, etc., at that end of the games industry, they're looking. I believe that they're looking for ways to escape the vocal minority, where they don't have to pay attention to them anymore because money. So I've got a couple of just those two things to talk about today, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about these things as well. So first up, we'll cover the movies thing, the movies comparison first. So I'm sure this is a comparison that's been made many times, and I know I've even compared the movies industry to modern movies industry to the modern gaming industry in terms of what are they choosing to greenlight, right, for projects? Do they all have to be Marvel billion-dollar situations? And that goes for both movies and games, things like that. I've definitely discussed that before. But back in the like late 40s, early 50s, there was the growing concerns around the movies industry at the time was that there was too much monopolistic stuff going on, anti-competitive kind of situations happening, and chiefly this existed around the idea of vertical integration within the industry amongst a few studios, and that was becoming a problem that regulators were going, government was thinking, maybe, I don't even know if we can get away with this. And if you don't know what vertical integration is, it's essentially the concept of a single entity owning everything from the start, if you want to think of it this way, the raw materials of a thing, straight up through final sale to customer. And the integration part is typically it's they haven't started having everything. They made a whole bunch of money doing one of those things, and then they started buying up the rest of the process all the way down until the point where they just have it from beginning to end. And in the case of movie studios, that meant that from controlling it from what was getting greenlit to filming and production all the way up through distribution at movie theaters that they themselves owned. And given the relatively scant few movie studios and those who had the power and money to do so, that was the whole problem. And so eventually they were forced to divest themselves of some of these integrations. to bring balance to the force, if you will. Now, with the games market, without me saying anything else, you're going to say, think to yourself, wow, that does sound awfully familiar. And that's because it is. It's very familiar. The only real wrench in it all in terms of getting something like anti-competitive or monopolistic stuff to stick, other than greasing the pockets of people that might make those decisions, is distribution. Video games and even movies now, of course, for reasons that I'm sure you'll be able to put together, video game distribution has almost always been, if not always been, different from that of movies, especially movies during that era where predominantly you were only ever going to see them in a theater. It wasn't like home viewing was really a thing at the time and whatnot. Eventually they'd go on to sell movies in big box stores, and you'd have like your own 7,000-pound 12-inch television running a tube in the living room and heating your house in the winter months. With video games, pretty much right out of right off the rip, you were buying them from brick and mortar locations, and there were tons of brick and mortar locations selling games. Right, there was a lot. The diversity of where you could buy was not a problem, and so that level of the integration was never really a major issue. And that became, to a degree, less and less over time as we got into more modern times with digital distribution, which has now even opened up opportunities for more and more indie developers to self-publish and release their games on platforms like Steam, for example, without having to rely upon some major studio somewhere doing that work for them to get that done. Print discs and relationships with brick and mortar and all that stuff. So it's technically, on paper, the argument can be made that it is even more accessible in that regard. Now, obviously, the average person looking at that is still going to think, well, I mean, if like Microsoft, Sony, Tencent, and Embracer just buy up everything, even if it's just for the IP, I mean, how much of a difference are we talking here? And games cost more and more money to make, and so indies are becoming out of reach for many people, unless it's a hobbyist thing that they do after they work 3 jobs at home to be able to buy a carton of milk. And I'm with you, okay? I'm with you. However, from a regulatory perspective, harder to stick. Harder to stick on that. So as we saw, as an example, with Xbox and Microsoft acquiring Activision Blizzard King for $69 or $70 billion. They did actually come up against some pushback in the European Union and also at home base in the States. And that things are getting a little bit crazy when companies like Microsoft are actually getting at least a little bit of pushback. Even if it's performative, that we're approaching some lines. Yeah? So I thought that was an interesting thing to just to consider. And I do think that within reason, where the games industry is right now is sort of comparative in terms of the maturity of the industry to where movies would have been around the time where that was also happening in the late 40s, early 50s. And so it's kind of interesting, not that it's new either, that history to a degree repeating itself just in various ways. Nothing is new under the sun, as they say. So that was one thing that just came to mind. And of course, in considering all of that, I also thought, as this continues to happen, and as consolidation continues, and we seem to be in a position now where we are watching more and more PR disasters, or what would be considered a PR disaster, at the very least. How much of these PR disasters, as they were, or as they are, with a bunch of people like me, although many more people with far more traction than I ever have, and better opinions than I have, I'm sure, more weighty opinions than I do, all getting in on talking about things like the closures of Tango Gameworks and Arcane, etc. With all of that, how much does that actually matter? How much do the companies in question pay attention to this stuff? How much stake do they put in what is broadly known to be a vocal minority? And that was an interesting thought I had. And the follow-up thought I had to that, I don't think that was it was interesting to me, okay? I know. It wasn't that interesting. But the follow-up thought to that I thought was more interesting to me was perhaps the concept, as I mentioned in the beginning, that despite the fact that it's a vocal minority, clearly, in some instances, even if it's the exception and not the rule, the vocal minority has the ability to exert a substantial amount of pressure to the point in which they're bitching and moaning, for better or worse, elicits a response, as we saw with Sony and Helldivers 2. Just historic. Now, mind you, Helldivers 2 was almost bred for this, right? The community was trained to move as a unit. They moved as a unit, and they historic levels. They put out historic levels of review bombing on the Steam page, and in fairness and credit to that same community, after the decision on the regional issues surrounding the PSN, account linking requirements was reversed, they too largely reversed the 300-some thousand negative reviews that rolled in over a 48-hour period of time. That's impressive. But even with that, the thought, that is the exception, not the rule. And even amongst exceptions, that one is exceptional, right? The Helldivers 2 specifically. But as we see in other places of the industry, and with all of the studio closures and the mass layoffs and whatnot, and while some of them can be cold logicked away, some of them, like the Tango Gameworks situation, make less sense. And clearly, if you are somebody that participates in games media, whether you create it yourself or you're one of the 5 people and a dog that are currently watching this video now, you would have seen yesterday pretty much the whole industry, whether it was people working within the industry or in media or players themselves, everyone unanimously, my little social media silo at the very least, finally broke free of the Drake and Kendrick Lamar shit for like 5 seconds so that I could see everyone screaming at Microsoft for these moves. And so that all had me thinking there has to be at some level an effort internally at these places to find ways to escape having to worry so much about this vocal minority amplification via social media and other means. Because even if people hate admitting it, when people say the video games industry is bigger than all other media combined, it is. And the majority of that, especially right now, in today's gaming market, is thanks to casual gamers. Because they're the ones on mobile throwing away buckets of money on those platforms by engaging in revenue-generating practices that have been normalized there that just do not fly in the same way in the console and PC market, which allows things like Genshin Impact to make $5 billion in like 4 years. And even if you were to take the ones that didn't make the crossover to PlayStation and the PC in that way, there are lots of other mobile-only gacha games, specifically in this instance, that make hundreds of millions of dollars on a yearly basis, like clockwork. That's where the money is, right? So, with that, and the majority being them, and those people, by and large, although gacha might be into some degree a bad one to engage with, although maybe not, because even then, those who know where the gacha community can be very vocal, it's still a minority that are vocal. and they still print money. Even when people are salty about whatever Genshin banners have come up or whatever, they still are printing money. So I think the idea stands. It's the vocal minority. But the majority of people are in that group that aren't engaging in games media or even hearing about this stuff. In the instance of Hi-Fi Rush, for example, from Tango Gameworks, the critically acclaimed, well-received, ghost dropped, niche genre, and yet brand new IP, like just impossibly easy W for Microsoft to hold on to that and to hold on to that studio, if only for the goodwill. It wouldn't cost them very much money in the grand scheme of things for the goodwill that could come out of it, which has a lot of value in and of itself. It got shut down. And I lost my train of thought because I did not sleep enough last night and was putting in tickets for her family to come for the wedding. And it got very late. So where was I going with this? Tango Gameworks and Hi-Fi Rush. Oh my goodness, I am getting old. But they get shut down. I know where I was going with this. So them getting shut down, the people that played Hi-Fi Rush, it's not like the majority of people that played Hi-Fi Rush even know who Tango Gameworks are. They just definitely do not know. They don't have a freaking clue. And the follow-up to that is, do they even care? Other than to say maybe they really enjoyed the game and they're going to be maybe a little sad that they're not going to likely see a sequel. That might be it. Beyond that, they don't know. They're not seeing this news. They're not interfacing with any of these, things on social media or otherwise. And so when decisions like this come down, and you think to yourself, man, I mean, on one hand, you've got Helldivers 2 and the community, got so involved and so engaged. But the reality is, in most instances, you're dealing with communities that people aren't as engaged by the nature of the beast, and they don't know, and they're not going to interact. They're not going to have quite as much impact. But even then, with all these people in the games industry, inside and out, complaining to Microsoft about this stuff, that represents such a small minority, they don't care. They're just going to move. And there's a difference between Helldivers as a studio getting a lot of blowback, even though Sony deserved most of that blame, and Microsoft and Xbox receiving blowback at that level for those types of decisions. They're not really the same. And it would take a lot more, and it's a lot harder to damage them with these same kind of, sentiment shifting brief windows. In a couple of weeks' time, people might bring this, what's happening with Microsoft and Bethesda, what happened yesterday, up when Microsoft makes their next announcement, or when they, Sad Boy Phil does another fucking in-house podcast. But generally, this is going to get overdone by some other news thing. I mean, think about who was thinking that Sony's blunder was going to get overdone in overwritten in a few days. Nobody was thinking that, but it was. And I'm sure something similar will happen with this as well. So they just don't care. But at the same time, they have to care to a degree, otherwise they would never make moves. So my thought process is they're trying to create an escape vector. How do they get away from that? How can they make moves to not only not actually care on a theoretical level, but literally stop having to care because the money won't move with that sentiment anymore, or to such a small degree that they no longer have to care. So I thought about what that might look like. And really, there's just two major things that are happening right now that I don't necessarily think have been happening because they were doing it to escape the impact of the vocal minority, but I do believe that they are large contributors to allowing them to do so over time. The first thing is diversifying where the revenue comes in from. So when I was talking about, for example, the Helldivers situation, for the Helldivers developer that was getting almost all of that blowback, that is directly impacting their revenue. There is really no other step in between. It's going to directly impact their revenue going forward with that game, but then also future revenue that they could have with that game as a franchise and as a game developer themselves. However, with something like Microsoft or Sony, you have things now that are becoming more and more normalized, like Game Pass, right? And Game Pass allows them to receive revenue that people are giving them money for access to a great number of games. And so any individual game on that service is far less likely to have an impact on the overall revenue that they're receiving for that service if something happens and social media explodes with a bunch of disgruntled customers over this one game. Well, the reality is that Game Pass services a ton of people for a ton of games. And so they're going to continue to receive revenue that is sheltered then to a large part from that kind of vocal minority screeching, yelling into the void on the internet, which admittedly, again, sometimes has the ability to elicit a response. But they don't want to have to respond to that, I don't think, anymore. I think they'd rather just not give a shit. And so that's kind of part of the theory. Global expansion. Global expansion would be the second part of this. I think it goes without saying that every region has players that kind of have, they will take to social media and other platforms when things aren't going their way for various reasons. But the reasons that they happen in various regions might differ, and many of the problems that they might face in the West might not exist elsewhere. And I think this is an interesting one to talk about specifically because of what Microsoft just did with Tango Gameworks, where Tango Gameworks and why it was so confusing that they shut them down, is that Microsoft had been fighting to get into the Japanese game market for decades now. And have at best over time only had little glimmers of hope. And I mean like a grain of sand level. Almost, but it was there. It was there, right? And damn it, we could see it, and they were making moves, trying to make it happen. It's very difficult, but Japan just never, ever really wanted to or found it enticing to get behind Xbox as a platform when Nintendo and Sony were sitting right there. But nevertheless, Xbox invested a lot of time and resources into trying to break into that market. And now here we are, after their purchase of Bethesda. Inadvertently, here's Tango Gameworks, who were already working on Hi-Fi Rush as like this, just go away and make something different, stretch a little bit, get away from having to make the same stuff kind of a situation. Hi-Fi Rush comes into existence, and it was before the buyout, to my recollection. And so Microsoft gets this handed to them. Outside of the fact that it was because they purchased Bethesda, kind of just hand-delivered. Here you go. Here is a brand new IP that was critically acclaimed and otherwise for such a niche, sold well, and would continue to sell well as it was just recently placed on your competitor's marketplace on Sony's side. And it's in a market that you desperately wanted. So it's a Japanese game developer making a game that would more likely do well in Japan, give you some bonus points, wasn't even something that you had planned. It was a successful game out of the gate, did not cost a lot of money, would not have cost a lot of money to keep that train going, if only to help get that foothold and to get some bonus points from the PR perspective that you feel like or have felt like for years have desperately needed. Otherwise, we wouldn't see Sad Boy Phil so damn frequently. And you throw it away. So this is an interesting one, this whole global expansion. Because what I actually mean about global expansion is China. When everyone talks about global expansion, what they really mean is China. It's such a huge market. It's enormous. It dwarfs many of the other markets, with the exception of maybe India. And it has a burgeoning middle class that are just dying to get rid of their newly acquired disposable income. And games is a large part of that, especially mobile gaming, to say the least. I mean, that is really the kicker, which is part of why Microsoft wanted to get access to King in the Activision Blizzard King deal. But that's what they really mean, is getting into China. But by doing so, again, and opening yourself up to a substantially larger possible install base of customers. The bigger that base is, the smaller the minority of whiners become, the less we have to care about them. And we can put them in a corner and just, they can scream and yell all they want and blah, blah, blah. And even with the amplification of social media, it'll be more and more rare for a situation like Helldivers, for example, to come up and require us to have to intervene at all. And we can just ignore all of these people and make money where the money actually is, which is the casual market. And the hardcore market be damned. The hardcore market is what now? And in fairness, to some degree, the hardcore gaming market, and especially in the vocal minority, these are people that even get upset about little idiosyncrasies in games like Spider-Man 2, which cost, I think it was like $200 million without marketing. Just a huge amount of money, right? So, I mean, when somebody looks at Spider-Man 2, which has to clear like 7 to 10 million copies at full price to break even, and it's only available on PlayStation 5 even. Or you could take $200 million and make Genshin Impact. And then support that game and make $5 billion. You can see why some of them might be trying to escape all of this madness and go somewhere else. From a CEO's perspective, where they don't give a shit about, the other than the money part, the actual art form of games, which I think is a totally different video. I almost spun into that for a second. I'm going to stop myself. But there is, and I will say this. I did, if you haven't watched it already, I did a couple of videos. I did one about where I thought the future of games was heading, and I think what we're seeing with Microsoft is actually pretty pertinent when talking about that video. And then also I did a video on why game budgets are broken. I think both of those kind of relate to this. But the concept of not making one $400 million game, but making, four $50 million games that have a marketing budget. And having a greater chance of actually having profitability across a broader range of titles that could all at any point in time explode into their own thing, instead of being in a situation where you have, I think, for example, an Arcane where they have Redfall, where this was a single blunder that was continued to be supported by Microsoft even when there was concerns that it should be converted to single player during development to avoid it becoming a bit of a disaster, which it inevitably was. And spending all that time, all of those resources, and now we got to shut them down. And they were one of the most talented groups under Microsoft, or under Bethesda, under Microsoft. But yeah, I have to stop myself before I get into a totally different video topic. Nevertheless, there you go. There's my cheap coffee fueled video of the morning. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Let me know what your comments in the comments below what your thoughts are on this stuff. How do you feel about the comparisons between the movies industry in the more early days and where we are now in the games industry? And how do you feel about the concept of Xbox and PlayStation and others at that kind of macro level? Do you think that they're also trying to find ways to, find vectors of escape from the vocal minority, since that's not where the money is for them? Do you think that that's the thing? And then there's also, I guess, almost an entire video around the discussion of, what kind of future does the gaming industry have in store if that is where their mindset is, which I guess to a degree is my future of games as well, but to a less degree. I could make another video. Anyway, oh God, how have I been a content creator for so long? This is my problem. I became a streamer for too long. Now I don't know when to stop. I'm leaving now. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for watching. I'm leaving. Have a good day. Bye-bye. Oh, man.